The nonpartisan Wisconsin Legislative Audit Bureau has released its audit of the Fish and Wildlife account for fiscal year 2024. This audit was published as report number 25-15 in August 2025. The following is the report summary. The Fish and Wildlife account is one of 10 accounts in the Conservation Fund, which is a statutorily established segregated trust fund that finances many of the resource management programs administered by the Department of Natural Resources, or DNR. Revenue for the Fish and Wildlife account is derived primarily from user fees, including the fees for licenses and stamps that are required in order to hunt and fish in Wisconsin. Certain Fish and Wildlife account revenues are dedicated by Wisconsin statutes for specific programs. In addition, Wisconsin statutes require DNR to spend hunting and fishing license fees only for purposes related to exercising its responsibilities specific to the management of the fish and wildlife resources of the state. DNR spends the funds for activities such as fisheries and wildlife management, law enforcement, customer service, license administration, and property and equipment management. To help support certain fish and wildlife management activities, DNR also receives funds from the U.S. Department of the Interior through the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act and the Dingell-Johnson Sport Fish Restoration Act. The Pittman-Robertson Act provides funds for wildlife restoration and hunter education and safety. The Dingell-Johnson Act provides funds for sport fish restoration. We evaluated expenditures made in fiscal year 2024 by DNR with Fish and Wildlife account funds. We also evaluated how DNR spent certain federal funds it received under the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act and the Dingell-Johnson Sport Fish Restoration Act. Fish and Wildlife account revenue increased from $114 million in fiscal year 2020 to $140.9 million in fiscal year 2024, or by 23.6%. The $140.9 million in revenue included $69.8 million, or 49.5%, from fees for hunting and fishing licenses and stamps, and $37.9 million, or 26.9%, from federal revenue received primarily under the Pittman-Robertson Act and the Dingell-Johnson Act. 2023 Wisconsin Act 19, the 2023-2025 Biennial Budget Act, increased certain non-resident hunting and fishing license fees and made a one-time transfer of $25 million from the forestry account to the Fish and Wildlife account in fiscal year 2024. Excluding the $25 million transfer, Fish and Wildlife account revenue was $115.9 million in fiscal year 2024. Before the Act 19 increases for certain hunting and fishing license fees, most fees were last increased by 2005 Wisconsin Act 25, the 2005-2007 Biennial Budget Act. Fish and Wildlife account expenditures totaled $126.2 million in fiscal year 2024. The $126.2 million in expenditures included $92.9 million in expenditures supported by state revenue, or 73.6%, and $33.3 million in expenditures supported by federal revenue, primarily from the Pittman-Robertson Act and the Dingell-Johnson Act. In fiscal year 2024, DNR spent $24.9 million, or 26.8%, of Fish and Wildlife account expenditures supported by state revenue for fisheries management, $18.5 million, or 19.9%, for law enforcement, and $16.3 million, or 17.5%, for wildlife management. Shared expenditures totaled $44.9 million, or 48.3% of the fiscal year 2024 Fish and Wildlife account expenditures supported by state revenue. Within the Conservation Fund, some expenditures are funded by more than one account and are shared with other accounts, such as the Forestry account and the Parks account. Such shared expenditures include those for certain activities pertaining to customer service, law enforcement, facilities and property management, debt service, and other activities. Shared expenditures also include $9.6 million, or 10.3%, of DNR's department and division level administrative costs, which are limited by statute to 16.0% of annual Fish and Wildlife account expenditures. Activities supported solely by the Fish and Wildlife account, which were not shared expenditures, totaled $48 million, or 51.7%. Although DNR documented the methodology it used to allocate shared expenditures expenditures to each account in the Conservation Fund for fiscal year 2024, DNR did not establish any written policies for the process by which it makes changes to its methodology, and we recommend that it do so. In the financial report DNR provided to us, we found that DNR did not allocate all expenditures and revenues for the Fish and Wildlife account in fiscal year 2024 in accordance with its allocation methodology. As a result, the financial report understated expenditures allocated to the Fish and Wildlife account by $5.1 million and also understated Fish and Wildlife account revenues by $5.1 million for fiscal year 2024. We recommend that DNR ensure that it consistently follows its allocation methodology and conduct an appropriate review to ensure that it has done so. We determined that $46.3 million, or 49.8% of Fish and Wildlife account expenditures supported by state revenue, was spent for activities that primarily benefited hunters and anglers. To determine the extent to which expenditures benefited hunters, anglers, or other users, we classified Fish and Wildlife account expenditures supported by state revenue in fiscal year 2024 by type of activity. We also determined that $36.7 million, or 39.5%, was spent for activities that benefited hunters, anglers, and other users. In addition, we determined that $0.3 million, or 0.3%, was spent for activities that did not directly benefit hunters and anglers. Administrative costs totaled $9.6 million, or 10.3% of Fish and Wildlife account expenditures supported by state revenue in fiscal year 2024. As noted, Wisconsin statutes limit DNR to spending no more than 16.0% of Fish and Wildlife account expenditures on department and division level administrative costs in a fiscal year. In its February 2024 biennial report to the legislature, DNR reported that it spent 14.1% of Fish and Wildlife account expenditures on administrative costs. However, we found that DNR included $5.2 million of expenditures that should have been excluded because they were neither department nor division level administrative costs, and DNR excluded $960,900 in division level administrative costs that should have been included. We recommend that DNR consistently report its administrative expenditures in its biennial report using the statutory administrative cost definition. To improve the transparency of its expenditure of Fish and Wildlife account funds, DNR could choose to provide additional information in its biennial report beyond that which is required by statute, and we recommend that DNR do so. We assessed the extent to which DNR appropriately spent Fish and Wildlife account expenditures supported by state revenue in fiscal year 2024. To do so, we conducted 3 file reviews, including a review of 130 non-staffing expenditures totaling $9.3 million that were supported by $6.2 million in Fish and Wildlife account funds, which showed the expenditures appeared to have been made by DNR in compliance with the purposes outlined by the associated appropriations and appeared appropriately related to DNR's responsibilities in managing the fish and wildlife resources of the state. A review of 105 individual DNR staff who charged time to activities supported at least in part by Fish and Wildlife account funds, which showed that 104 of the 105 individual staff charged time to activities that appeared consistent with the duties specified by their position descriptions, and a review of 123 conservation wardens who charged time to certain Fish and Wildlife account supported activities, worked at least 1,000 hours, and charged a majority of their time to activities other than training. We determined that 16 of the 123 conservation wardens we reviewed charged certain amounts of time at frequencies that were substantially higher than other wardens. We recommend that DNR establish written policies and specify when DNR is to provide training on submitting and approving timesheets. In fiscal year 2024, DNR spent $26.0 million in federal Pittman-Robertson Act funds and $11.1 million in federal Dingell-Johnson Act funds, including $32.7 million from the Fish and Wildlife account. Of the $26 million in Pittman-Robertson Act funds DNR expended in fiscal year 2024, DNR spent $6.8 million on habitat and species management, or 26.2%, $5.9 million on wildlife land management, or 22.7%, and $4.6 million on research and monitoring, or 17.7%. Of the $11.1 million in Dingell-Johnson Act funds DNR expended in fiscal year 2024, DNR spent $5.3 million on surveys and monitoring, or 47.7%, $1.7 million on boat access activities, or 15.3%, and $1.6 million on fish research, or 14.4%. Federal regulations specify 22 types of activities that may be supported by Pittman-Robertson Act funds and 16 types of activities that may be supported by Dingell-Johnson Act funds. We reviewed available information for 230 non-staffing expenditures totaling $5.1 million DNR made for projects supported in part by the funds from each act. Our review found that DNR appeared to have complied with federal regulations and spent all $5.1 million for eligible activities specified in federal regulations. We also reviewed timesheet data for 50 individual DNR staff who charged time to activities supported by Pittman-Robertson Act or Dingell-Johnson Act funds in fiscal year 2024. We found that the 50 individual staff charged time to activities that appeared consistent with the duties specified by their position descriptions, and that staff did not appear to have charged time for ineligible activities specified by federal regulations. We make 9 recommendations to DNR for improvements. Please see the complete list of our recommendations on our website. We also include 1 issue for legislative consideration. To view this and other publications from the Nonpartisan Wisconsin Legislative Audit Bureau, please visit our website at www.legis.wisconsin.gov/lab. To report fraud, waste, and mismanagement in state government, please contact our hotline at 1-877-FRAUD-17.